This is the first of several videos on cooking for beginners, and we'll begin with knives, just that essentially most of the cooking that we do will involve knives. And if you ever decide you want to buy a new set of knives, you may want to know what to look for. Here's two paring knives. This is a stamped blade. This is a forged blade. One of the differences that you can't see on video, but you'll have to take my word for it, this stamped knife is lighter than this forged knife. The difference in how you make a forged versus a stamped knife is that a stamped knife is pretty much as it described. It takes a sheet of metal and there's a stamping machine that stamps the shape of the blade, and the manufacturer takes that and creates the different angles on the edge, which are usually 2 or 3 different angles to help support the final edge. And we'll continue on this vein, and then he takes the knife. This is the tang, the non-working part of the knife, puts it onto the handle, and then attaches the handle to the tang with 3 rivets. Same thing with this, but the difference is that this knife, one of the obvious differences that you can see is that it has this bolster, and it also has a finger guard. Now you can say, well, this is a finger guard. Yeah, it's kind of a finger guard, but you can see that I might be able to cut myself. I'm much less likely to cut myself on this knife. And that's one of the differences you'll see between a stamped and a forged knife. A forged knife will have this bolster, which is significantly heavier and adds weight and balance to the knife versus this stamped knife. And a forged knife takes a piece of metal, heats it, and then hammers it, and it may repeat the process a number of times, may even fold it. And then when the shape of the blade has been created, the edge is formed, and it may have, again, 2 or 3 angles until the final cutting edge is created. And it has the same thing. It has a tang, and it usually has 3 rivets. In a cheap blade, I'm trying to find a cheap blade for you. I thought I had one. Here's an example of a cheap blade or a cheaper blade, and I'm not disparaging stamped knives, but this is an example of a cheaply made knife. This is a bread knife. It has these serrations. It has a handle, but you can see that the tang isn't visible as it is in this knife. And as a result, you don't know if the tang is half of the length of the handle or where exactly it goes. And this is glued on. This does have a relatively nice finger guard, but it doesn't have the hilt. And the hilt adds a certain balance to the knife that you can't have in a stamped blade. So this is an example of a paring knife. This is an 8-inch chef's knife. This is a 6-inch chef's knife. And here's the paring knife. It's nice to have a variety of chef's knives. You don't want to cut a carrot with an 8-inch. You might not even want to cut it with a 6-inch knife. But it's helpful to have a variety of different size knives. This is a chef's knife, and this one has what are called hollows in the blade. And these are could be semicircular or oval, hollowed out areas in the blade, and they serve 2 theoretical purposes. The first purpose, it allows the manufacturer to perform the edge and make it thinner than it would if the blade was not hollowed out. And the second advantage, again theoretical, is because of these indentations, as you're cutting material, the material will ride over these indentations, and so you'll have less friction, and you'll be able to manipulate this knife, in theory, better than you can this knife. In practice, I don't find the difference, but you'll see some knives having these hollows. These are called hollows. You'll want to get a knife, a chef's knife, that has this contour, this curvature. And it allows you to rock the blade as you're cutting it. And that'll be the subject of another video. And in a paring knife, you want to be able to have a paring knife that's relatively small. And being able to rock the knife isn't as important. You want to be able to manipulate it and have relatively better control over what you're cutting. So the rocking ability of the knife isn't anywhere as important. This is a relatively cheap stamped knife. They did a nice thing by coating the edge. But you can see this is an 8-inch knife, and it doesn't have much of a curve to it. So your ability to raise it significantly off the cutting board isn't as great. One of the things that you also want to get is an iron. Now, an iron isn't used to sharpen a knife. It's used to help realign the edges of the knife after you've used it. It doesn't sharpen it, it realigns the edges. As you're working on a cutting board, the edge microscopically will splay to the left or to the right of the blade, and the steel, as you do this, will realign those edges so that they're no longer splayed to the right or to the left. You can buy a blade, an iron that's kind of flattened out, oval like this is. You can buy one that's round, such as this one is. It's a personal preference. I prefer this. I think I have the ability to straighten out the edges in less strokes just because of this flat area, but that's a personal preference. I like the fact that this has a relatively broad hilt on it. So if, as some people do, they like to go inwards as they're using the iron, this has more of a guard in case I overshoot myself and cut myself, while this has relatively a shorter hilt, a shorter finger guard. So those aren't made to sharpen a knife, but they're made to realign the edges. You will ultimately need to sharpen your knife, and you can have it done professionally, or you can buy a sharpener, and there are a variety of sharpeners available. What you do want to buy is a sharpener that has the same angle at the edge of the blade that the manufacturer created. And typically you would prefer to buy a sharpener that's made by the manufacturer, because the angle that's created will be the same angle as the knife. And most will have a coarse and a fine setting. And if your knife's significantly dull, you may want to use the coarse setting. When you do this, you don't want to press hard. You just want to let the weight of the blade fall on the ceramic cutting angles, and do that about 30 times, 40 times. And then you'll go to the fine section. Again, you're not putting weight on it. You're just letting it, the weight of the knife hit the angles. This has a nice guard. I like it. You can also get, in case you have knives from different manufacturers, which I do, and they may have different angles, you can buy a sharpener that you can self-dial the angle. And typically, an angle can be anywhere from 12 to 15 or 18 degrees. I wanted also to discuss the material that you make knives from, and it doesn't have to be stainless steel. This is an example of a good quality stainless steel knife. The advantage of stainless steel is, for the most part, it doesn't get rusty, although it can if it's a poor grade of stainless steel, and there are various grades of stainless steel. This is an excellent example of a carbon steel knife, and this knife is about at least 80 years old. And you can see the tang. It has a wooden grip. It has a poor man's finger guard, but again, this is an 80-year-old knife. And the reason I bring this up is the carbon steel probably is the one material that creates the best edge, the sharpest edge. The downside with carbon steel is it'll rust in a moment's notice. So you have to be very careful about cleaning it and then immediately drying it. As an example, you need to be vigilant to be sure there's no moisture that gets into the area between the tang and the handle. And this is a wooden handle. Wood can be porous and absorb water. So it's almost a setup for this to fail. But here's a beautiful example of something that's 80 plus years old, if not 100. And the rivets are still great. The edge is fantastic. A little wear on it, but a wonderful, wonderful knife. And the last thing, you want to be able to cut whatever you're cutting on a surface. And you don't want to use a surface that's stronger than the edge of your knife. Otherwise, you'll dull it. So typically, it's wood, such as this. The advantage of wood, I think, it's aesthetics. It's pretty. They come in different sizes. The downside of wood is it needs a little bit more care. You can't put it in the dishwasher. And by the way, none of my knives go into the dishwasher. It can dull the knife sooner than it would ordinarily. The disadvantage of this is it doesn't go into the dishwasher, and you have to oil it once a month. And I use olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, and I have several wooden blocks, fairly large wooden blocks, and I apply it on both sides of the block and then let it dry, wipe it off, and that works just fine. The other is you can get a plastic cutting block, and this one has the advantage if you're using something that has a lot of juice and you're cutting it, the juice will tend to accumulate in these squares and not fall all over the place as in this flat cutting board. Again, plastic. The flip side of this cutting board has this trench, and it does the same thing. If you're cutting meats or cutting something juicy, the fluids will fall over to the trench and not fall over other places. But again, you don't want to cut something, use your knife on a surface that isn't softer than the edge of your knife. Your knife doesn't typically get dull overnight, and one way of determining if it's sharp or knife is to take a piece of paper like this, take your knife, and then try to cut the paper. You can see one knife is much sharper than the other knife. and this is the sharp knife by comparison. Before we leave the whole knife thing, I just want to mention that if you have a sharp knife and you lay it in a drawer against other sharp knives, they will ultimately get dull because you're having two pieces of metal with equal or similar hardnesses against each other, and so you'll dull them. And the best way to prevent that from happening is to use a knife block like this one, where I have different size chef's knives, the steel, that's other knives, cooking knives, eating knives, and this protects the knives from accidental contact with other surfaces that may be harder than the edge of the actual knife. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed the video and got something out of it. I do have a link below with some links to knives and sharpeners, steels, and cutting boards that I think are a good value, and I get a small percentage if you buy from these vendors. But look at it anyway, and you can see what I consider a good valued item. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.